In this lesson, I want to continue our discussion of SDL2. The reality is most of you who are watching this series probably want to do something with the graphics library, like OpenGL, Vulkan, Metal, or whatever the next library is that's out there. So I'm going to talk about exactly how to do that and set up a program that's ready to run for graphics. And I'll have specific videos on how to get set up on Windows, Linux, Mac, etc. following in this series. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so here's the idea. We've been able to create an SDL window as shown in some of our previous examples here, where we create a window. But the reality is that gives us this much here. And I'm going to just title this SDL2. But we really want to be able to render something in this window here. And what we need is to initialize OpenGL. So in order to initialize OpenGL, we're going to need to figure out what version and create what's known as a context. And this is a part that a lot of people get confused on, or perhaps is not really explained. There's something called the OpenGL Context, which is basically a giant object that's controlling the OpenGL state machine. You can imagine a program that's running a lot of graphics needs to figure out how does it draw that graphics. There could be lots of options for perhaps the quality of settings, how far you're drawing things, and so on, that would be set or controlled through this sort of global object in a sense. And that's exactly what OpenGL is, and we need to be able to tell it what features to support, what hardware you have, and so on. That's largely controlled by your OpenGL drivers. So our goal for this lesson is just going to be able to set up that OpenGL window and perhaps set a background color. So let's go ahead and proceed with that. Now that we have the high-level idea of what's going on, that we have SDL2, which is a windowing framework and can allow us to draw things on it with its own API, but we want to enable the ability to take this window and connect it to an OpenGL context and render stuff using the OpenGL API. All right, let's see what it takes. All right, so we're going to need a little bit of setup here. So let me give you a little bit of a history lesson here by bringing you to the OpenGL loading library. And basically, there's a bunch of helping libraries that can allow us to do this. And the history lesson is that after OpenGL 1.1, in order to extend the functionality for OpenGL, is what they've done is come up with various extensions. So these extensions can tap into hardware and enable certain graphical features. And there's a bunch of different loaders here. The one that's worked particularly well for me is glad, and that's the one that I'm going to show you here. So we'll go ahead and see how glad works. And I'm just going to go ahead and Google glad OpenGL and click on this link here. And basically what we have here is a web tool that will generate a header file for us. Now, again, this is going to seem a little bit confusing, but what glad is doing is it's generating a header file that says, look, here's all the OpenGL functions that we want to be available. And as long as our hardware, say if you have a relatively recent graphics card, supports those features for particular functions, those will be enabled or made available to you through this header. So this is the first part to just get OpenGL up and running on our systems. The second part of that will actually be telling SDL that we want to create a graphics window that utilizes OpenGL. So let's proceed with creating glad, and then we'll get back into the SDL stuff. But what I want you to understand is the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we have available all of the modern features of OpenGL by downloading glad here. Okay, so let's go ahead and choose our language. We're going to be using C and C++. And what's important is for us to choose the OpenGL version. Now there's other versions of OpenGL that support, say, embedded systems. That's what GLES is, 1, 2, and 3, but we're interested in the main API. I'm going to generate one for version 4.1 because I know that'll work on most machines, for instance, for Macs, Linux, and Windows machines. And as soon as I've done that, you'll see a bunch of extensions that show up here. These are those features that I'm talking about that are going to be supported on the hardware. So let me go ahead and pop those back in here. And you can go ahead and search these. By default, I want to add all of these to my list here. So let's go ahead and add all of them. And we'll have all those features. Now, there's a specification here for OpenGL. and we can have different profiles. So this is another thing that's a little bit confusing about OpenGL. But basically, the core profile means that we'll have all the 4.1 features. And we won't have any of the old stuff, however, that was deprecated. The capability layer, on the other hand, would allow us to be backwards compatible. I'm going to push us towards the state of the art, and we're going to use the core features here. But you may have different needs where you need to support older hardware, and you can do another version of that for yourself. So once I've done this, I'm going to click Generate, and this should take a moment to zip up a file for me, which I can download here. So let me go ahead and download this zip. And I've got my glad folder here, which I'll bring up here. I'm going to extract it and copy it and place it in my SDL2 tutorials and my setup here where I am working. So inside here, what I've got is the source, which is a glad.c file. Let's take a quick look at this here. And I'll have all the extensions on the date that's generated here. And you can see most of these functions are a little bit obscure. But if we look at the start pf of n, so this is some function pointer. This tends to be the signature. It's for OpenGL, this particular function, get frame buffer parameter, and so on. So it's loading this actual function and this actual extension to allow our hardware to do whatever this function does, whatever this function does, whatever this function does. This is how we're setting up the OpenGL library. Okay, so we'll have that source file that we need. So I'll go ahead and remove this. And the other thing that was generated was that header file for us. So let me go ahead and populate this as well. And we'll see if we scroll through this, all the different functions also defined so that we can include this header file and have access to our OpenGL functions. So regardless if you choose GLAD or some other tool, they're all essentially doing this same task. So let me go ahead and remove this. And that's all we need to worry about for now. So at this point, let's go ahead and just do something simple. Let's go ahead and go back to our program here. I'll keep our diagram up here. And let's try to include that GLAD header file. So just to see where I'm at, let me navigate in my tutorials here, where we are. And we have the GLAD folder here with us. The first thing that I'm going to need to do is also include in my third-party libraries the GLAD extensions. So I'll include, and where did those exist? The GLAD folder in glad.h. Let's go ahead and save, and I can confirm that by just listing out the contents here. And I guess there's a few different ways that we're going to do this. We're going to add our include path onto our compilation line to make sure that it can find the glad.h file. So let me go ahead and do that as we compile. So we're going to modify our compilation command progressively here. So not only do we have the main.cpp, but we also want to include our include folder, which is in the glad file here. So let me restructure this just a little bit, make sure I find the right path. So it's in glad and include. Glad/include. And I think that was uppercase I. Still can't find it. And that's because it was a lowercase I. So this is our compilation now. I'm going to move this just so it's on one line so you can see it nice and clear here. So with this, we now are aware of those OpenGL functions. But we haven't done anything OpenGL yet. We've set up or made possible the ability to call into one of these functions. So let's go ahead and proceed to making an OpenGL window now at this point. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is look at our code here. First thing I'm going to do is update our compilation in our comments so that you have that available in the GitHub repository provided with these lessons. And just make sure we're up to date here. There we are. And one of the options when we created our window was to provide various flags. If you recall from one of the earlier lessons, we did have a flag that was for the OpenGL window. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up the SDL documentation, and I'll go ahead and do that in another window here. And we want to go ahead and look at the SDL window create. So let's go ahead and just do a search here, because we know what that function is. SDL window. Let's see, SDL window create. See how good it is at finding it. SDL create window, my apologies. And here's the function. So let's go ahead and click on it and look at the remarks. And if we scroll down and keep scrolling down, let's see where the options are. Here they are. So we want an SDL window OpenGL. So I'm going to go ahead and populate that here. We could have other options here because this is a bit field. So I'm going to just demonstrate that here. So let me go ahead and recompile this just to show you that it's legal. And at this point, if I try to run this project, it is running and it's doing our old stuff with the various keyboard presses and so on, but no OpenGL function calls at this point. We still need to do a little bit more setup. So if our window has been created, or rather before we create our OpenGL window, we need to specify what version of OpenGL that we're using. So before we create our window, specify GL OpenGL version. So how do we do this? So for this, there's going to be, again, specific attributes that we can set here. And in a sense, at this point, this is going to be a little bit weird, but I'm going to go ahead and just bring in the documentation for where would you find this. So SDL GL get attribute is the help page where you would set various OpenGL attributes. So let me go ahead and copy this. We're going to need this several times. And there is actually a nice example here where we can see that we're setting the attributes before we create the window. And then eventually we're going to create this context that says, okay, create OpenGL, this object that tells how OpenGL is going to work, what version it is, what features it supports, and so on. So this is the setup that we're going to follow. So let me go ahead and remove myself. And the main attributes that we want to set are, let me go ahead and type them out here. SDL GL set attribute, SDL GL context, major version 4. Okay, and let me copy this again. I'm going to do these one at a time. And now the minor version, well, 1. So this is going to put us in OpenGL 4.1 at this point. And I'm going to set some other attributes. SDL GL set attribute. And this attribute is going to be SDL GL context profile mask, SDL GL context profile 4. So again, I'm doing this here because this is the core profile that we want with version 4.1 matching the glad headers that we generated. Now, if for instance you set the profile to say 4.3 and you have a glad version of 4.6, that just means some of those features won't be supported. That's okay. Usually OpenGL is smart enough to figure that out, or you can query what features are available if you have a little bit of a mismatch. So the last two things that I'm going to want to do here. Well, first, let me just do a compile to make sure that we are all set. That's good. As I'm going to set a few more graphics attributes here for our graphics window. SDL GL set attribute again. And I'm going to do SDL GL double buffer and enable that. SGL GL set attribute SDL GL depth size 24. So what this is going to do is it's going to generate a window that's essentially updating twice as often and has 24 bits for the color here. Well, let me just make sure that this compiles with no mistakes. And there we are. We've set up our window here. And now, as mentioned, it's time to set up our context. So in order to do this, we're going to follow the similar example that's shown on the right here. And we need to create this GL context object. So let's go ahead and do that. And because, as we can see in this example, that it's being created for this specific window, we'll create it after we created the window here, just so we get our ordering right. So let me go ahead down here. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is do SDL GL context. And I'll create the context and set the context equal to SDL GL create context for our specific window. So let me go ahead and compile. And let's go ahead and try to run this and see what happens. See if it's still running. And our program still is running, and it's taking in different key presses. If I move the mouse around, it'll also capture our mouse events. So at this part, so far so good, but we haven't done any OpenGL yet. So let's go ahead and make sure that we try to make an OpenGL function call, and let's see what happens. So at this point, what we need to do is two things. Well, one rather that I want to try as an experiment. Let's go ahead and try to do an OpenGL function call here. And the function call that I want to do is just something to clear the window every frame here to give us a new color of our screen. So I'm going to go ahead, and after we handle our events, we'll handle our drawing. So I'm going to minimize this window just a little bit so you can see all of the program at once here. And that's so I can see the entirety of the loop here. So after we've handled our events, I'm going to set the GL clear color to, let's do a red background. So 1, 0, 0, and the alpha value will be 1.0. And then we'll call GL clear. And we're going to clear the depth buffer bit as well as the color buffer bit. So this is what's going to actually clear the color in something that we call the frame buffer. Now let me go ahead and try to compile this. And here's where we get a problem here. We have undefined reference to glad underscore GL clear color, undefined reference to glad underscore GL clear. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger just so you can see the errors for a moment. And I'll recompile and add in the compilation command that failed. So at this point, what we see here, anytime that we get undefined reference, and I'll bring myself back in the screen, that means we're missing something. We haven't linked in or appropriately brought in some piece of code. It doesn't know what this actual function is. So we do have actually the glad.c file, so that should be part of our compilation. So let's go ahead and try to compile that with our code here and see if that will resolve the issue. Otherwise, we'll need to link in some external library. But let's see what we can do here. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and see if part of our compilation can be that glad.c file here. So I need to see where that lives. And if I list the contents of glad, there is a source file and the glad.c file. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this with our compilation. So we want the main.c as well as our glad.c. So if I hit enter, well, this looks like it's almost working here. It resolved our linking errors, but now it's getting an undefined reference to symbol DL close. What could that be? Well, if I look at the man page for DL close, I happen to know that that is a C function for loading shared libraries, like the glad library that we're trying to load. So likely we need to link with DL. I may have mentioned that in a very early video, so we're going to also link in DL. And let me show it on one screen, just so you can see it all together. I'll hit enter. And again, almost there. So far, so we're getting closer. And oh, this just looks like a typo. I need to link the actual library. There we are. And now it looks like it's almost running. So let me go ahead and let's try to run this again with prog. I enter, and I get a segmentation fault. So where could the segmentation fault be occurring? And this is where things are a little bit tricky. So we could run this through GDB and try to find the exact line. But more than likely, what's happening is we're making function calls to OpenGL function libraries, but we just don't know about them. So we've got to do one more thing on the setup, and then hopefully you'll understand the full setup for OpenGL with SDL. So let me pop out here and we'll add one more line of code. So again, the problem is that we're making these function calls and we don't know exactly where they're coming from. They're being set up by our gladLibrary. So what we have to do is before we even make one of these function calls, we need to know where we're calling those functions from. And this is where the gladLibrary helps us. So after we've set up our context here, OpenGL setup the graphics context, we need to set up these function pointers. Set up our function pointers. And essentially how we do this is we have a function call for this. gladLoadGLLoader and SDL get proc address. And let's go ahead and see if that fixes things. If I run it, it does compile. If I launch our program, it is running here. The mouse is moving and so on. I'll fix the color in one moment, but no segmentation fault. So let me go ahead and terminate this. And let's go ahead and add just a few more OpenGL things because we need to specify each frame. Well, not necessarily each frame, but I'm going to just put it in our loop now. The size of our OpenGL viewport. GL viewport. 0, 0, and we made our window 640 by 480. So I'm going to match that here. And let's go ahead and try to run this again and compile it. And it's still our window here. Let's go ahead and just terminate that. And still can't figure it out. Well, there is one subtle thing that we did. We are rendering, we are using OpenGL. There's no segmentation fault at this point. But remember, we're doing something with our OpenGL window when we set the attribute here for it to be double buffer. That means it's refreshing and flipping between, well, we have a front buffer and a back buffer. If this is a new concept to you, don't worry. I'll talk about it a little bit more later on. But the idea is that for our SDL window, it has to know that that's how it's refreshing as well. So in order to handle this, at the very end of our display loop here, what I'm going to do is do SDL GL swap window, and we need the address of our window here. So let's go ahead and just confirm this in our documentation. If I search for GL SDL GL swap window here, I'm going to copy. Let's just paste it in here. See if we get the documentation here, and it needs a address of our window. So I could pass in the address of our window since it's within the local scope here. Let's try to refresh here and make sure I have the right type. And I'll move out of the way here. And oh, of course, this is already a pointer, so I don't need to get the address. That's already storing one. And I'll run it here. And voila, now we have a red window. So this has been quite a deep dive into setting up OpenGL. But now that you have the framework, I've shown how it works on a Linux system, but you'll understand OpenGL from start to finish in a sense. Now, we'll learn how to compile specifically and what libraries to link if you're on a Windows machine or a Mac machine or whatever in future videos in this series. So hopefully you enjoyed that and understand, again, what's going on along the different steps of setting up and initializing OpenGL. We'll see you in the next one.